Hello, my name is Bob Dinsmore. Full name, Robert Sunderland Dinsmore. Currently, age 73. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska, of Eugene Clay Dinsmore, who himself was from Fairbury, Nebraska, and Ruth Sunderland, who was born in Omaha. In recent years, I've called myself the primary family genealogist of the Dinsmore, Dunmore families around the world. Although in every group in the family, regardless of the spelling of the name, there seems to be someone who keeps track of the old records. In our family, we had a copy of the book Among the Scotch-Irish by Leonard Morrison. This was written in 1891, so it's now 108 years old. Morrison lived in New England. He traveled around a bit, met a number of Dinsmores, and other copies of this book exist. When I went back to Princeton, I found one in the library there. The New England Historic Genealogical Society Library in Boston has a copy. Many members of the family have copies. Sometimes they're bound with a blue binding, sometimes red. There's a Dinsmore family that had a home in northern Kansas that's shown off to the public today. It's called the Garden of Eden because of the cement statues that are around its yard. And on a table in the middle of the house are three books. One is Among the Scotch-Irish by Leonard Morrison. Another is The History of Windham, New Hampshire by Morrison. The third one was The History of Londonderry, New Hampshire by Morrison. Each of these books has in it major information about the history of the Dinsmore family. Now, there were no telephones in 1891, as far as I know, so that it was a bit difficult for Morrison to get all the facts. Today, with our great libraries and access through the internet, we're able to get much more information, even about people who lived back in those days. Morrison may say that in a certain area of the country, the names he's listed are the only Dinsmores known in the area. But we know now that there may have been other families in the area. No phone books, I mean, it's difficult to find them. There were some trade journals, of course, trade listings. Now, he tells the story of a letter sent from Northern Ireland to a Dinsmore, he calls the letter writer in the United States, telling the early history of the family. It goes back in the letter to 1600 to a Laird Dinsmore, D-I-N-S-M-O-O-R. And Laird lived, he was called the Laird of Auchenmead. And I don't know if he lived at Auchenmead or if it was a hereditary title that came down from a prior generation. He was supposed to have been born in that area about 1600, but the great book by Pont on the Cunningham district of Scotland in Ayrshire mentions Auchenmead, mentions all the landowners in that area, but there's no Dinsmore listed. Although there was a Dinsmore in the late 1500s who had a farm in Bath that was nearby. So it may be that that was the right person, the right lineage. It may have been the father of Laird. Anyway, Laird had two sons. The younger son, John, disliked holding the stirrup for his older brother when he got on his horse. In those days, fealty would be pledged to the older son who would inherit the property. So John took his belongings in a big knapsack, his boots, and took off for Northern Ireland to County Antrim, which has been the main heavy Presbyterian part of Ulster. And he had four sons. John came to the United States, and he was a stonemason. His family was back in Northern Ireland when he was building a house for her, and he was up on the roof finishing the house. It was on an island off the coast of Maine, and the local Indian tribe came by and captured him. And he became a favorite of the chief. He used to paddle his canoe. Well, seasonally the Indians would go up north, so John Dinsmore was ready to push off the canoe for them to leave, and the chief said, "No, John, you much honest man, you go Boston." And he told him how to hide in a cave along a path for 3 days and eat berries while the other Indians came up the tribe, and then he'd be free to go. He went to Londonderry, which was at the heart of the Scotch-Irish community there in New Hampshire. And and that was a famous branch of the family. I call them the Dartmouth Dinsmores. Some of them spelled their name M-O-O-R, some O-R-E. From that branch, we had a father and son who were both governors of New Hampshire. The letter writer I mentioned, Robert Dinsmore, the rustic bard, would send a copy of his book of poetry to a famous historian in Scotland. And from them came Samuel Dinsmore of northern Kentucky, whose home is still shown off, operated by the Dinsmore Homestead Foundation. His uncle, Colonel Silas Dinsmore, who lived nearby. Colonel Silas had been appointed Indian agent to the Cherokee and Choctaw Indians by George Washington. He was a pretty well-known person at the time. George Washington wrote a letter to the Cherokee and Choctaw advising them to follow the instructions of Silas Dinsmore and the other Indian agent because their game were disappearing and they'd have to learn how to do things white men's ways in order to survive. Of course, it was a number of years later that the Indians were moved out to Oklahoma because, in part, white settlers wanted their land, but also in part because their way of living had disappeared and they had to survive somehow, so it was thought that they could do it better in Oklahoma. So there were good and bad reasons both for moving the Indians. Colonel Silas was also appointed Indian agent to appointed the customs official of Mobile, Alabama, where he had a little meeting with Andrew Jackson one day and refused to allow Jackson to take his slaves across Indian territory lest they be declared free men. He also represented the United States with a treaty with Barbary pirates along the Mediterranean. One of many treaties with the Barbary pirates, but he was involved in that. His nephew, Samuel, has a homestead that's still shown off to the public in Kentucky, in Brenerton, Kentucky. He retained 60,000 pages of family correspondence and 90,000 pages of correspondence with people outside of the family. I'm told he was a friend of John Muir, a hunting companion of Teddy Roosevelt. He had his own library he maintained there, and he was a farmer, an interesting fellow. His daughter had a book of poetry published by Doubleday, and for 5 generations, the granddaughters, great-granddaughters, and all came back to that site to have their babies born. If you have a chance to go to Kentucky, you can stop by today and see the home. Another branch of the family ended up in northern Kansas with a home called the Garden of Eden. From his estate of his first wife, he used some of the money to build cement statues around the property. Near the front door, Adam and Eve. Eve's holding a red apple for Adam. Towards the back, there's some scaffolding, and a man is putting a ballot in a ballot box. In another corner of the yard, there's a woman pointing to him, showing a black man that someday they too will have the right to vote. He was a populist and was concerned about the political affairs of the day. That's just one branch of the family. My branch came from, which I call the Princeton branch, was derived from another of the 4 brothers in Northern Ireland and came to western Pennsylvania. But there were 4 brothers who became Presbyterian ministers, and my ancestor was the Reverend Thomas Hughes Dinsmore, who came out to Iowa and Kansas. He was an educator and a home missionary, and he was the president for a while of a college in north central Kansas, and later a business manager and a professor of physical sciences and mathematics for Highland College in Highland, Texas. One of his sons, Dr. Robert Scott Dinsmore, was the head chief of surgeons at the Cryle Clinic, now called the Cleveland Clinic, and it had been had taken on Annie Oakley in shooting contest.